Hello and welcome to Aero Innovations. I'm Aero and I'll be your host this evening. If you're new to the channel and you're looking to smash low stakes, no limit hold'em, then you've come to the right place. I analyze every notable hand I play and give you complete details on my thinking process. Tonight's session is going to be a deviation from my normal vlogs. As most of you know, I try to keep my sessions between 3 to 4 hours. This is the duration that I play my absolute best poker. I can make very clear reads, lay down huge hands, and call super light if I think I'm good. During these first few hours, I'm very clear-headed. Many of you have asked, if I have such a great hourly, why don't I put in more volume? Well, I'm about to show you what happens when I play a longer session. Keep in mind, I've been a professional for over 17 years now. I have a very long track record of what happens when I play longer sessions versus shorter sessions. However, as some of you know, I admitted in an earlier video that I have an addictive personality and also a gambling addiction. So once in a while, the worst part of my nature gets the better of me. Without further ado, let's buckle in our seatbelts and jump right into the action. As usual, we're playing 2-5 no limit hold'em at the Win Encore in Las Vegas, where I bind for 1,500, which is 300 big blinds. We're going to take a small step back in time to Wednesday, January the 8th. As a rare occurrence, I start the night at 8:58 p.m. A few minutes into the session, the middle position limps. I limp in the low jack with Jack 9 of spades. The hijack raises to 15 with a stack of about 900. The button and middle position both call. Okay, so I could definitely call here. It's only 10 more to me and I definitely have a good enough hand to defend. However, I'm going to take a different route. A $15 raise after you already have 2 limpers denotes a whole lot of weakness. It's some silly pot sweetener. I think I have a very good chance of taking down this pot without a fight. So I limp raise the action up to $80. Everyone quickly folds, so I snatch away the dead money. Plays like this is how I'm able to balance when I limp with actual monsters, like aces or kings. Just because I limp raise doesn't mean I have an actual good hand. I always try to capitalize on perceived weakness when I see it. A lot of pros like to claim you should never limp raise with big hands like kings or aces. Well, I defy the norm, just like how I defy what people think is possible to make as a standard hourly rate for low stakes. There are countless different ways to be profitable as a professional poker player. GTO? More like GTFO. About 25 minutes later, I open to 15 under the gun with ace-8 of clubs. The cutoff, small blind, and big blind all call, so we go 4 ways to a flop of jack, 6-8 with 1 spade and 2 diamonds. We flop middle pair, but it's on a board with 2 diamonds and against multiple opponents. Not the best flop, but there's some chance we could still be good here. The action checks to me. If I had position, I would definitely bet here, but since there's still 1 player left to act, I check the action back, and thankfully so does the cutoff. The turn comes, and it's a 4 of spades, putting 2 spades on board. 5-7 makes the nuts. Small blind checks, but big blind leads for a very tiny bet of 20 into the pot of 60. This is an incredibly wet board. This tiny bet perplexes me. It's a third pot bet on a board with a possible straight, and not 1, but 2 different flush draws. I consider raising here, but I might be stepping into a trap. This player might be baiting someone to raise on purpose if he actually has a monster. I do have position to the better, so I decide to just smooth call and see what happens on the river. Everyone else folds. Off to see the river, and it brings in the 8 of hearts. We improve to trip 8s with the top kicker. Suddenly our opponent throws out a complete overhead smash to the tune of 150 into the pot of 100. Damn, if he'd made a normal bet, I would have raised for sure. Now I'm not sure if I even want to call. There are 3 different possibilities here. A jack would never make this bet. That would be suicide. Our opponent either has a missed flush draw, which could be either of the 2 various flush draws out there. He could have an 8 like me and think his 8 is good, or he really was trapping on the turn. This might include a set that just improved to a full house, or a hand like 5-7 that turned the nut straight after all. Of those possibilities, I'm not getting anything extra out of a missed draw. A straight or a boat has me completely crushed. If I were to raise here, I'd be targeting exactly the last remaining 8. And it's a bit of a stretch to imagine a naked 8 going for such insane value here on this river. I mean, what could I possibly have to call him with? So, going through that line of logic, I think I can only call or fold. Raising seems out of the question. It's a bit hard to fold trips with top kicker though, especially when your hand just improved on the river after a tiny turn bet. So I do decide to make the call. Our opponent flips over 5-7 for the turn nut straight. He really was trapping after all. It's a good thing I didn't underestimate him. The only thing we could have done differently is fold on the river. 10 minutes later, there's a live 10. The cutoff limps. I raise to 55 on the button with my least favorite premium hand. You guessed it. We're talking about the accursed pocket kings. Only the big blind and cutoff call. So we go 3 ways in position to flop a 4 ace ace with 2 hearts and a club. Both players check to me. Yeah, right. This board is a freaking landmine. The only saving grace is that there's 2 aces out there instead of 1, decreasing the odds that someone has an ace here. Okay, so a mistake I see a lot of players make on a board like this is to bet, even though they have an underpair to the top card. Do you really expect to get 3 streets of value from someone not holding an ace? My advice on boards like this, when you're holding a big pair, but it doesn't beat the top card, is to go for 2 streets of value instead of 3. Assuming you're good, you're much more likely to get paid off by worse hands. So I just check the action back. The turn comes and it brings in an 8 of spades, not changing anything unless one of our opponents is holding pocket 8s. Big blind counts out betting chips, but he only leads for 65. The cutoff thinks over his options for a moment. He takes a full 30 seconds before making the call. Okay, strategy time. Unlike if we're holding a hand like pocket 6s or something similar, this is not about calculating implied odds to make a call when we're behind. The implied odds is simply not there in a single raise pot like this. So the cutoff tanked for a full 30 seconds before making this call. That leads me to believe he's worried about what I might do. He could have an 8, or he could simply have any number of small pairs. I don't think he's all that strong though. Now let's discuss the big blind. He could have an ace here, but he chose a relatively small bet. If he'd gone with a full pot or anywhere near full pot bet, I would have just folded. Instead, he bet barely third pot. I don't think he's all that strong either. But it is possible he could be completely nutted here and trapping, similar to the guy with the 5-7 from the first hand we played tonight. Keep in mind, this was only a single raised pot. I don't think our opponents realize how strong we actually are here. And we do have position, so I do decide to make the call. Let's reevaluate after the river based upon what our opponents do. So the river comes, and it's a 3 of spades. It's not a king, but it's about as good as it gets aside from being another ace. It gets even better when both of our opponents check over to us. Okay, so now the pot has bloated to an alarming 370, but that's only because there are 3 players involved. Each of us has only contributed $120, and no one is particularly invested. I'm almost certain we have the best hand, but we're targeting very weak hands here. Our only opposition is either an 8 or possibly a pocket pair even smaller. When you want to squeeze out thin value, you have to keep in mind the hands you're targeting. So I throw out an extremely milky bet of $100. The big blind quickly folds, but for this small price, the cutoff does pay us off. We table our kings, and they're good. For this hand, a full hour has passed since our last notable hand. I've since changed tables. Here, there's a live 10. I open to 25 on the button with pocket 4s. Small blind folds, but the big blind shoves all in for his remaining stack of about 200. The straddle folds. When a short stack shoves, it's not necessarily always a massive hand. It could be anything from ace high to sometimes king high, and oftentimes even much worse. And a $200 shove may seem like a lot in a 1-3, but in a 2-5 deep stack game where the max buy-in is $1,500, this is very much a short stack. So I make the tourney style call. The board runs out queen, king, 8 with 2 hearts, which looks like I'm staring death in the face. The turn is a jack of hearts, but then the river is a 10 of hearts. There's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel after all, as I table my 4 high flush, and my opponent flips over pocket freaking kings for the flop top set that got rivered by a 1 card 4 high flush. Do you guys still doubt why I call pocket kings the accursed hand? A full hour later, the straddle is on. Middle position opens to 30. I 3-bet to 100 in the low jack with pocket jacks. The cutoff and button both cold call, and the middle position comes along as well. We go 4-handed to a flop of 8, king, 7, rainbow. Middle position checks. Not a big fan of this flop. Any one of my opponents could have flopped a set of 7s or 8s here, and even that king beats me, so this is just a clear check. Thankfully, the action checks around. The turn is a 6 of clubs, putting 2 clubs on board. Middle position checks again. Time to find out where I'm at. I think if someone flopped a set or that king, we would have heard about it by now. So I put in a tiny feeler bet of 150 into the pot of 415. Only the button calls, while the other 2 opponents fold. The river brings in an 8 of spades, pairing the board. Great! This is a really good card to see. Pocket 9s and 5s both miss. The flush draw missed, and we happen to counterfeit a hand like 6-7 suited. The only hand we're potentially worried about is a hand like 8-9 suited. If we check here, a hand like 8-9 suited could potentially throw out an extremely large bet for value, which would put us in a really disgusting spot. So instead, I decide to name my own price and target hands like pocket 9s and 10s with an extremely small bet of 200 into the pot of 715. This is similar to when we had pocket kings. We need to use a small enough bet sizing to get weaker hands to call, meanwhile not getting overzealous because we have to keep in mind that we don't have a very strong hand on this board texture either. The button lets out a dejected sigh, which we love hearing, and he puts in the call. We table our jacks, and he flips over pocket 10s for a slightly worse hand. Alright! Back to even now at this juncture. I was stuck for nearly 800 at my low point. About 30 minutes later, the middle position opens for 25 with a stack of over 2k. I called in the cutoff with Jack 8 of clubs since the middle position has been raising almost every hand and I have position to him. Normally I wouldn't call with a hand like this for this bet sizing. The big blind calls as well with a stack of about 750. So we go 3 ways in position to flop of Jack 8 4 with 2 spades. We flop top 2 pairs on a decently connected board. Big blind checks. The middle position throws out a strong c-bet of 60. I start cutting out chips to call in position and trap, since I highly suspect the middle position doesn't have anything. But then I notice the big blind starts to call too. I'm not about to trap multi-way with only 2 pairs on a dynamic board with 2 spades, so instead I announce a min raise to 120. The big blind cold calls my new bet amount anyways, but the middle position folds, even to the min raise. Big blind was going to call 60, but ended up calling 120, which is considerably larger than the pot. Usually, this is only ever a draw of some sort. I'm thinking in my head, if a spade comes, it better be the 8 of spades. That aside, I need to avoid a queen or a 7 in case he has a hand like 9-10 for the open ender. So the turn comes, and it's a very safe looking 9 of diamonds. Big blind checks. This 9 doesn't help me though. If anything, it might hurt me and increase the number of outs my opponent could have if he's holding a flush draw that contains a 10 or some similar hand. However, we are almost definitely still good for the moment, so I smash out a bet of 300 into the pot of 375. Again, our opponent quickly makes the call, leaving himself only 400 behind. The river arrives and it's clean. It's a 6 of diamonds. Suddenly, Big Blind shoves all in right out of left field for his remaining stack of 400 or so. I snap call. I mean, I'm only realistically losing to 2 hands, both of which would have shoved the turn already. He needs to have either 10-7 or 10 queen of spades, very specifically. My opponent announces a straight, and of course, I say it's good. Here, listen to the audio.
That was straight. It's good?
Yeah, just
Of course
fold.
it's good. Tell me.
Just fold, it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so even though I say the straight is good, as a professional, I don't fold. I wait to see the actual goods. You can even hear someone else chiming in to tell me to hurry up and fold my hand. I've seen this angle far too many times, so I hold on to my cards and wait for my opponent to table his. But instead of the straight, he flips over King 8 offsuit for a ridiculously overzealous third pair, and I table my hand for the winner. Never fold your hand without seeing the actual winning cards, guys. I saw a podcast where Bart Hansen answered a call, and his caller admitted to pulling the same exact angle and getting the winning hand to fold.
You say you have aces, okay? Your hand gets tabled at 7-8 suited, okay? And the guy basically mucks his hand. This is where the floor comes in with discretion and obviously makes a judgment call and says, no, you were intentionally trying to deceive the other player.
So yeah, people do this shite. Don't fall for it. 45 minutes later, the under the gun and low jack players limp. Small blind folds. I put in a tiny pot sweetener to 15 in the big blind with ace-9 of diamonds. I mean, my hand isn't great, and my position is terrible, but I think I have the best hand currently, and I don't mind bumping up the pot just a little bit. I don't want to get overzealous and bloat the pot up beyond my comfort level with a bigger raise though. So here, both opponents call. We go to a flop, which is 6 ace-10 with 2 spades. This is a pretty darn good flop. Ace-10 has me drawing pretty close to dead, but it already had me beat pre-flop anyways. I beat plenty of weaker aces, the obvious flush draw, as well as 7-8 for the open-ended draw. So I lead with a bet of 25 into the pot of 45. Under the gun calls with a stack of about 900, but the low jack folds. The turn comes, and it's a king of clubs, putting 2 clubs on board, but otherwise an extremely safe card. Jack queen does make a straight, however. I lead for 60 into the pot of 95. My opponent calls again. The river is a jack of hearts. A naked queen now makes a straight. Nothing to do here but check. Betting would be suicide. You get all the weaker hands to fold, leaving only better hands to either call or raise you. You also deny any missed draws to make a last-ditch effort to bluff. So I check, and my opponent takes the bait, throwing out a pretty substantial bet of 155. Hey man, if you ended up on the river with a queen-high flush draw, congratulations, take my money. But otherwise, this is a very obvious bluff attempt. I very quickly make the call, and my opponent shows 3-4 of spades for the missed flush draw. Alright, 2 pretty big wins in the last hour. We're now up a very solid $1,202 after about 4 hours and 20 minutes of playtime. This is normally when I would call it a night. I was stuck almost 800, climbed out of the hole, and now I'm up a very profitable $1,200 after barely 4 hours of work. That's a great night and a great hourly. This is what my vlogs would normally showcase. However, on this particular night, the moon is a waxing gibbous, and I'm feeling the compulsion to rip off my shirt and howl into the night, but instead, I fight the impulse and just continue to play more poker. Plus, I hadn't been playing much poker this last month due to all the holiday stuff, so I felt like I should put in some extra hours to make up for all my laziness. Oh, by the way, guys, super quick insert. If you guys want to play some online poker, join my Telegram. Telegram's kind of like a Discord. It's like a online chat group kind of thing. And I'll put the link down below, and it'll get you all the information you need to play some online poker. I know that NorCal Poker, he has a meetup group he does all the time. You can play with him. So check it out. And if you want to play with us, I'll see you soon. A few minutes later, after the last hand, there's a live 10. I open on the button to 25 with pocket 4s again. Same as I did earlier when I cracked those pocket kings. The small blind 3 bets me to 75 with a stack of about 725. He's the same opponent from the last hand who tried to rob us with 4 high. The big blind and straddle fold. We have position, our opponent has a big enough stack for us to set mine, and we might even have the best hand, so I make the call. The flop comes 2, 3, 8 with 2 hearts and a diamond. Our opponent down bets to 60. This flop will miss the vast majority of his range, so I make a pretty standard call. The turn is an 8 of spades, pairing top pair. Instead of even taking a moment to think about it, our opponent very quickly bets out 175. We are losing to a very obvious overpair, but I think an overpair would normally slow down a bit and at least consider checking on this 8. I consider going all in here to rep that 8 in case we're behind, but since our opponent has barely over 400 left anyways, I don't think he's folding if he has an actual overpair. Plus, if he is bluffing, we want him to get desperate and blast off on the river. The board is extremely small, so there's no chance to be counterfeited here. Okay, real talk now. I'm only invested $135 at this point. If I call this $175 bet here, I'm forced to call his $425 shove on the river, assuming the board doesn't change. That's a $600 investment that my opponent either has complete air or a flush draw that still has like 14 outs against my particular hand. I think if I were still in my 3 to 4 hour time frame, I could just fold here regardless of whether I'm currently ahead or not. It's just not worth the money investment in the off chance I'm ahead. But here I do decide to make the call, fully prepared to call a river jam. So the river comes, and it's a 7 of diamonds. We don't improve, but we weren't really expecting to. Our opponent shoves for his remaining stack of 425. And of course, since we made the call on the turn, we have to make this call here. Our opponent shows pocket freaking aces to cut deep into our profit margin. Ouch! That hurt. I should have just left at my usual time frame. 30 minutes later, the small blind posts his missed blind. Big blind limps. I race to 25 in the middle position with 10 jack of spades. The low jack, our nemesis with the aces from the last hand, 3 bets to 80. The other players fold, but I make the call. We go heads up, out of position, to flop a 10, 3, queen, with 2 hearts and a diamond. We flop middle pair with the backdoor straight draw. As any sane person would do, I start with a check. Our opponent down bets to 55. He could easily have ace-king here, ace-jack, or any number of hands that miss this board, so I make a pretty straightforward call. The turn is a 3 of hearts, completing the front door flush. Again, I can only check here. If we face any further heat, we're just going to have to fold. Thankfully, our opponent checks the action back. Either he's being cautious with an actual hand, or we're pretty good at the moment. The river comes, and it's a 9 of diamonds. Jack King makes the nut straight. Holding only middle pair with no kicker on a board where both a straight and a flush are possible, again, I can only check. Our opponent throws out a very meek bet of $100, which is barely a third pot bet. If he'd gone for any real size here, I'd have to reassess and possibly look for a live tell. But against this size, there's no brain work required here. This is a pretty simple snap call. I only need to be right here about 1 in 5 times for this call to be profitable. How did I come up with that number? Well, the pot is $280. Put in my opponent's $100 bet. Now put in my $100 call. That bloats the pot up to $480. My $100 call into that $480 pie is very close to 20%, otherwise known as 1 in 5. If you're ever on the fence about making a call, which means you're split evenly 50-50 on whether your opponent is bluffing or not, as long as you're facing a pot-sized bet, you should always just make the call. You only need to be right 1 in 3 times to come out even in the long run. You're basically getting 2 to 1 on your money. One portion is the pot, and one portion is the opponent's bet, and one portion is your money to call. And if you're split 50-50 between calling and folding, that's basically a 1-to-1 ratio. One portion for you to be right, and one portion for you to be wrong. So the math works out for you to simply make the call. So I make the call, and my opponent flips over ace-4 of spades for the good old-fashioned no pair, no draw. I take a small bit of revenge against this opponent for his pocket aces earlier. So this sets the scoreboard at 2 correct calls and 1 very bad call against this particular opponent. 15 minutes later, Under the Gun opens to 20 with a $1,200 stack. He's our same opponent from the last 2 hands. The middle position, low jack, and small blind all call. That's $80 of trapped money. I look down at ace-queen offsuit in the big blind. I have a terrible position, so it'll be hard to play this hand post-flop if I don't hit anything. I can either just simply call the $15 more and hope to hit, or I can take the aggressive approach and try to take down all of this dead money now, or potentially try to outplay any opponents that call post-flop. So that's the option I decide on, as I put out a massive raise to 150, which is the same size I would use if I had an actual big pair here. For this raise amount, the Under the Gun player tanks, but then he shoves in his entire stack for $1,200. That actually doesn't symbolize a lot of strength to me. I think if he had an actual hand, he would just simply put in a hearty 4-bet. I mean, he has position to me after all, and a stack big enough to break down into multiple raises. His shove looks like he's trying to take down all of the dead money without a fight. So while I'm contemplating how to respond to this, the low jack makes the decision for me. He reshoves for his whole stack as well, totaling $1,300. The small blind folds. It's $1,150 more for me to call. There's $490 worth of trapped money. I think one of my opponents has a middling pocket pair of some sort. The other opponent could also have either a middling pocket pair, or potentially ace-x, taking away some of my outs. I contemplate my option to call for a moment. I think if I had a hand like ace-king, I could warrant a call here due to the trapped money. If we're up against 2 middling pocket pairs like jacks and queens, or 10s and jacks, we would have great equity with our 2 overcards. However, with a hand like ace-queen, it's possible we could only have 1 live card. So after 40 seconds of thinking things over, I decide to make the fold. The flop comes 10, 10, 2, rainbow. The turn is a king of clubs, and the river is a 7 of spades. Under the Gun shows ace-jack of hearts, which is a hand I had completely dominated, but the middle position flips over pocket jacks for the winner. See, I knew the Under the Gun shove was weak, but when the middle position player reshoved, my hands were pretty tied. As it turns out, ace-king or ace-queen were both in the same spot mathematically, but that's being too results-oriented. This is one of those rare instances where either of my cards would have been good if I'd hit, but I was correct that someone likely had some of my outs accounted for. 20 minutes after the last hand, I opened to 20 in the middle position with ace-queen offsuit. The button and big blind both call. So we go 3-handed to flop of jack, deuce, 4 with 2 spades. Big blind leads for a 3/4 pot bet of 45. Normally I would just fold here. A jack high flop isn't very good for my range as the original raiser. On top of that, it's not like the big blind has shown any signs of weakness. He could have a set here, 2 pairs with a hand like deuce 4 suited or even ace jack. He made a pretty substantial bet with regards to the pot, But instead, you're about to see how I play once I'm past my 4-hour peak mental state. So here I raise to 120 with absolutely nothing at all except 2 random overcards.
Stop it. Get some help.
Only one of which happens to be a spade. The button folds, but the big blind calls. The turn is a 4 of clubs, pairing middle pair. Big blind checks. I shoot out a full-blown pot-sized bet of 300, hoping to target a weak jack or a flush draw. Instead, the big blind slams the rest of his stack into my face for an all-in shove of 850.
You don't want to be like this. This is disgusting. This is awful in every way.
Regrettably, I have no choice but to fold. There goes $600, gone just like that, over playing ace-queen. The first hand wasn't too horrible. I don't see too much fault in 3-betting in that spot. But there was no reason for my aggressiveness this second hand. This was just a massive punt.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Oh man, maybe now you guys are starting to understand why I keep my sessions to 3 to 4 hours. The longer I play, the worse I get, and a whole different sort of terrible player starts to emerge. An hour later, we're down to only 6 players. Here, the cutoff opens to 30 with the 2K stack. I call in the button with 7-9 of spades. The blinds fold. The flop comes king, 10, queen, with 2 spades. We flop a flush draw with a gut shot to the dummy end of a straight. My opponent c-bets for a full pot-sized bet of 60. I'm not about to call with this hand pre-flop to fold now, so I make the call. The turn comes and it's a 3 of clubs, not helping us whatsoever. Our opponent suddenly checks. Maybe his hand isn't as strong as he'd like us to believe. Maybe he has a hand like pocket jacks or 10 jacks suited or some such. I might be able to take this pot down on the river, regardless of whether I actually hit or not, if I start setting up for a bluff right now. So I shoot out a tentative bet of 110 into the pot of 185. Our opponent makes the call. The river brings in a queen of spades, which we absolutely love seeing. We make the 3rd nut straight, and what's better, our opponent could have a hand like ace-queen. So when our opponent checks, I shoot out a strong bet of 225 into the pot of 405, hoping to get value out of a queen or a non-believing king, but fully prepared to fold if he check raises. Instead, our opponent just folds. It's nice to finally make a hand for a change. Here, the button opens to 30. He's the action player I mentioned earlier who raises a lot, back when I had the jack 8 of clubs and flopped the top 2 pairs. So here, I call in the small blind with pocket 6s, but the big blind folds. The flop comes 9, king 9, rainbow. This is not the best flop. I'm not even vastly ahead of 2 random overcards, so I check. My opponent comes out firing for a full pot-sized bet of $60. That's kind of a really big bet for a heads-up hand in position, so I make the call. The turn is a 4 of clubs, putting 2 clubs on board. Again, I check. He fires out another pot-sized bet of 150. This feels a lot like when I had the pocket 4s earlier and made that terrible call against pocket aces. Even if I'm currently ahead, let's assume our opponent just had 2 random overcards in the best case scenario, a hand like 10 jack or jack queen. Even then, he would still have 6 outs for his random 2 overcards, plus an additional 4 outs to hit a straight, and 3 more outs to hit a king to counterfeit me. That's 13 freaking outs to beat me by the river in one of the best case scenarios where I'm still ahead. This should just be a fold 7 days a week, except the moon is currently a waxing gibbous, and I've been playing way longer than my mental fortitude can handle, so I make the call. The river is a jack of clubs, completing the backdoor flush. I'm sitting here with freaking pocket 6s for crying out loud. 4th pair on a board that has a possible flush. Even a bluff against me might actually have the best hand here if he rivered that jack. So of course I check. But when my opponent, who's shown no signs of weakness so far, fires out a slight overbet to the tune of $500, I actually tank.
We've lost him.
It doesn't matter that my opponent is an action player and has a high tendency to bluff. Once in a while, it's possible for even action players to wake up with actual hands. Just like that guy with pocket aces earlier. Sure, he dusted off his whole stack with ace-jack suited in the end, but he still woke up with pocket aces to double up through me when I made that terrible call with the pocket 4s earlier. But this is the problem when I've been playing for too long. The fold button starts to become fuzzy and smeared on my play screen.
Please let me win one time.
So after several minutes, I actually put in the call. But my opponent says I'm good. He says he doesn't have anything. Oh, heck yeah. I table my hand, and he laughs in my face, turning over 8-9 of diamonds for flop trips. Bro, that was not cool. I just paid him off with 4th freaking pair in a massive pot, and he slow rolled me and then laughed in my face. I just can't believe I fell for it. He pulled the same exact stunt earlier against an elderly Asian man, and the floor had to be called over for his rude behavior. Turns out this guy's a joker that goes by the moniker King High Ken, and he's been thrown out of several casinos already. I actually get moved to his table again some days later after this session when security comes over. They ask him if his name is Ken. The funny thing is, he actually tries to deny it. So they ask him for his ID, and he says he doesn't have any. Since they can't prove that he's Ken, they kick him out for not having ID. Oh, but if you want further drama, David from the Absolute Nuts channel actually just filed a police report and lawsuit against this guy for assaulting him in the middle of the Golden Nugget Casino. Talk about a classy fellow. Only a few minutes later, there's a live 10. I open to 25 in the low jack with 4-6 of hearts. The small blind and straddle both call. The flop comes king, queen, 2, rainbow, without a single heart in sight. Both opponents check to me. Normally, if I still had even a shred of sanity left, this would be a very clear check. I may have raised with a speculative hand, but this flop missed me completely. I also don't normally bother stealing small pots when I don't have anything invested. But as we all know, I'm not exactly in my right state of mind right now.
Hey! No! Stop! Just calm down! Don't do it!
So I throw out a 2/3 pot bet of 50 with 6 freaking high and no draw whatsoever.
Help me! Help me!
I'm not sure if you've noticed yet, but once I go past my peak hours, this becomes a common motif for me. So for this bet, the small blind folds, but the straddle calls. The turn brings in a 10 of clubs, putting 2 clubs on board. Ace-Jack makes the nut straight. My opponent checks. Once again, with absolutely no pair, other than the tiny Asian pair beneath the table, I shoot out a substantial bet of 150. Instead of calling, our opponent puts in a massive check raise to 500, which thankfully lets me off the hook, because I was fully planning to blast off yet another bet on the river. With all of my delicious profits from my wins earlier in the session completely gone, I'm currently left down nearly $400. Here, Under the Gun opens for 30 with a stack of about 550. He's an Asian pro and former card dealer with dyed blonde hair that normally plays the 1-3 here at the win. The cutoff calls, and I look down at Jack 9 of diamonds in the small blind. Normally, being out of position and facing a larger than normal open size against an opponent with a shorter stack, this is just a clear-cut fold. But since tech support hasn't gotten back to me on why my fold button is broken, I make the call. So the flop comes ace, 8, king, with 2 diamonds and a heart.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
We flop a flush draw, but I start with a check. Under the Gun throws out a c-bet of just over half pot for 50. The cutoff folds, but I make the call. The turn is a 9 of clubs, giving us a pair to go along with our flush draw. I check again. Oddly enough, our opponent checks the action back. I'm very confused. I would have thought this board should have smashed his range. Maybe he's pot controlling with a hand like ace-10 suited, or maybe like just king-queen. The river comes, and it's a 3 of clubs. We brick out. So I have no choice but to check. A bet here from me would seem too suspicious and would get called down by any ace. Suddenly, our opponent throws out a massive bet of 150. I'm perplexed. What sort of hand checks the turn and now bets nearly full pot on this river? Since I'm tired and delusional, I start to think maybe I can get him to fold any single pair holding. So I put in a check raise and shove for my opponent's remaining stack of 320. He snap calls and flips over pocket freaking aces for the uncontested nuts.
What have I done?
Holy crap, man. I'm not sure I can play much worse than I am right now, but I'm gonna give it my darn best. For the last hand of the night, there's a live 10. The button opens to 30. Small blind folds. I 3-bet to 130 in the big blind with ace-queen offsuit. The straddle folds, but the button calls with a full stack of 1500. The flop comes 8-2-jack, all diamonds. We flop the nut flush draw with 2 overcards. This is actually a pretty darn good flop. We're a favorite against any naked jack. I start with a tiny down bet to 75. Our opponent puts in a raise to 180, which is actually really small considering the size of the pot. This is actually a very welcome raise, unless our opponent already flopped a flush. So I make the call. The turn is a 5 of clubs, not doing anything for us. So I check. Our opponent doesn't slow down. He throws out another considerable bet of 280, which is still less than half the pot, but perfectly suitable for a heads-up match. I contemplate shoving, but it's not like our opponent has shown any weakness. If he flopped a flush, or he has a hand like pocket eights, there's zero chance he's folding here. I'm not even sure if an ace or a queen will be any good for me if I hit it on the river at this point. Plus, I'm out of position. This is never a good spot to be in when you're on a draw. But he's giving me a really good price though, so I do make the call. The river is a very welcome 4 of diamonds. We make the nuts. Okay, so normally, since I'm out of position, I should go for a value bet here. The pot is nearly $1,200, and my opponent has shown no signs of weakness. I'm the one with the ace of diamonds, so it's not like my opponent could be betting in position with a semi-bluff. I should lead here for between $400 and $500. He'd be hard-pressed to fold a king or queen high flop flush. Instead, since I've been playing for nearly 9 hours, strategy is no longer something I'm capable of. So I check, hoping that my opponent would try to bluff this river. But unfortunately, my opponent checks the action back. We table our hand and win the absolute minimum. With this win, I crawl out of the hole, so finally drag myself to the cage to cash out. In for $2,300 due to $800 worth of rebuys early in the session, and out for $2,490 for a measly profit of $190 after 8 hours and 48 minutes of playtime. This is one of the worst sessions I'd played recently, but I'm thankful I was still able to walk away with a small profit. Hopefully this answers the question as to why I keep my sessions so short. Does this cash out look familiar? Back in vlog number 23, I showcased a session where I played for nearly 8 hours, and this is what the cash out graph looked like. As you can see, I peak at my ideal hours, but then I start a downward spiral the longer I play. This has been a pretty consistent pattern of mine, stretching back as far as I can remember. So now you guys know why I try to keep my sessions between 3 to 4 hours, so that I can try to keep within my peak mental fortitude. I just simply don't have the mental energy to play well beyond that. I'm just being realistic here and showing you the ugly truth. During my peak mental hours, I'm a poker savant, but as the hours stretch on, Aero falls asleep, and Aegon, the punter, comes out to play. It's like I'm a completely different person. I warn you guys this is what happens when I play long sessions, but now you have the actual proof. If I was able to provide suitable entertainment, please consider hitting that like button. If you're new to the channel, I promise I don't normally play this bad. But as always, I hope to see you in the next video.